Well, I'm standing inside our new house and it is cold. So we've decided that a wood stove is priority numero uno. We're building the hearth now, and we wanted to build it to the specs of the actual stove that we're getting. So I'm gonna show you a little bit about our layout and walk you through what we're gonna do. All right, this is the layout of the hearth, and it doesn't include any bracing or anything like that. We took the measurements with the minimum clearances and then added some space for good measure. We marked that out on the floor. You can kind of see those blue marks there. And that gave us where we needed to be for our overall measurements for the hearth. So it's gonna run this entire wall, but it's also gonna cut in here. And we wound up getting a Vermont Castings Defiant stove, which I'm really excited about because it has a griddle on top. You can cook on it. So we added a little bit of room to the front. The minimum space between the front of your stove and the front of your hearth is 16 inches. We went with 18 inches, give us a little more room. And then we're gonna be protecting this back wall. So we'll mount some sheetrock to the studs. Then we'll have an inch space, airflow behind there. Then we'll mount cement board, and I've got some really cool pieces of granite and marble scrap from countertops that was on the property when we bought it. And I'm gonna mosaic those into the hearth. So that'll go about 4 or 5 feet up the wall, and it'll also go all the way out. But it's not gonna just sit on the floor. We're gonna also raise it up, and ultimately that'll be about 1 foot off the ground. So enter the lumber that we have. So given what we have and what we want, the happy medium therein, we're gonna go with this 2x10. I have enough 2x10 to make this work. Those inner pieces right here, where those markings are, that's where the legs of the stove are gonna sit. So that needs to be reinforced. So we also have some 4x10, and we're gonna cut those to size and set those in there. Many cuts later, this is what we wound up with. This was all lumber that we had. You can see we ran a little bit shy, so here in the corners we had to use 2x6 and a second 2x6 on top of it that we actually had to rip to size using a table saw. And then the beam that I talked about earlier, we had an extra piece of. So I'm putting it in there as, it's not blocking, it's support for the cement board. You have to support the cement board at 16 inches on center. So I lined it up that way because this distance was about 18 if I would have used one of those 2x10s. So by using a 4x10, I'm able to provide plenty of support for the cement board. And then we will go ahead and set the chimney. Those are our trusses. It's gonna go back here. We made sure we had all the clearances that we needed for our stove. And the back of the stove will sit somewhere, let's see here. Back of the stove is gonna sit right where that blue mark is, right there. But the legs of the stove are gonna be solidly on this beam. So I'm feeling really good about that in terms of support for our heavy duty cast iron wood stove. Okay, well, I slept on it and I woke up early and I had a thought. And my thought is that I neglected to account for the cement board and the mortar and the chunks of granite, which will protrude into this doorway. Now, the door frame will extend an inch, but I'm still gonna be way over into the doorway there. So, unfortunately, what this means is that we have to shorten the distance from there to there, and we wanna do it on both sides so that our box continues to be symmetrical. All right, it's about 3 hours later and we have shrunk it in on each side. So I'm happy with that. This side is gonna have enough room for the 1/2-inch Durock and the mortar and the tile, plus a strip of sheetrock that'll come out a 1/2 inch to meet up with the sheetrock on that wall. And then this side will have enough room for, again, the 1/2 inch Durock, the mortar, the tile, and the door trim to run down there. So I'm happy with that. Fingers crossed that it all works out. I think it will. Finding these new angles was definitely the bulk of our time spent today. But once we did that, it went pretty smooth. In between the wood framing and the cement board, I laid down strips of leftover OSB from the roofing material. Then William and Clara put up some sheetrock for the vertical wall in back of the hearth. We did purchase 1/2-inch cement board to lay down on top of that for underneath the mortar and granite. Of course, after I had put all the material on top, I had a change of heart and took off the front section so that I could add some reinforcement to that part of the hearth that we're going to be standing on whenever we cook. Now for the fun part. So I don't have a wet saw. So I took the pieces of granite that we have and laid them out in a masking tape outline to make sure that they would fit. Full disclosure, I've never actually done tile before, but hey, why not jump in both feet with irregular patterns and shapes? So the granite that I had available was generally in dark palette and generally in a light palette. I decided that I had enough of the light to do the vertical faces and the dark to do the horizontal faces. So that's what I did. And the pictures that you're seeing now are the end result bit by bit. One thing I do want to take some time to show you is how I put up the vertical face. You have to use non-combustible spacers to distance your surface an inch out so that there's free airflow behind the surface. They're not really picky about what those spaces are, so I used closet rails, and that worked out pretty well. We cut up a couple of them and screwed them on from the front after I marked them from the back. And then it was time to put on the stone. So in this part of the project, I really couldn't do very much at one time because as the mortar was wet, I didn't want to overload it with weight and cause the stones to slide down. So this was a labor of love over many, many, many weekends. My layout didn't always transfer perfectly from the floor to the hearth, so I set the top border before I backfilled the inside, which allowed me to make sure that I had a straight edge across the top. But wait, there's more! So now I had to fill in all those gaps, and this was a little bit tricky because these tiles are quite thick and grout is expensive. So I used leftover mortar that I had and the most disgusting approximation of a frosting dispenser that I can describe, and I filled in most of the depth with just straight mortar before going over the top with the grout. I'm really pleased with how this has turned out. The blue masking tape represents where our wood stove will sit, and I will do a future video to show some retrofitting of our foundation and also the placement of the stove. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.